title Psychology of People Who Become Leaders When No One Else Will. The building is on fire and everyone is panicking. But somehow you're the one directing people toward exits and checking if anyone is left behind. Your workplace is asking employees to do something unsafe and everyone is uncomfortable but silent. So you're the one who speaks up to management despite knowing it might cost you your job. A family crisis hits and all the adults are falling apart, leaving you to make the hard decisions no one else wants to face. While others freeze, flee, or hope someone else will handle the emergency, you find yourself stepping forward, not because you want to, but because you can't live with yourself if you don't. You're not a natural-born leader. You're not seeking glory or power. You're not even comfortable being in charge, most of the time. But when situations arise where someone must take responsibility and everyone else is looking around waiting for someone else to act, your conscience won't let you stay silent or invisible. You become the leader not by choice, but by necessity. This is perhaps the most important and misunderstood form of leadership in human history. While our culture celebrates charismatic leaders who seek power and influence, the people who truly change the world are often those who step forward reluctantly when no one else will. They lead not because they want to, but because they must. Let's start with what's actually happening in your mind when you become the reluctant leader. Most people in crisis situations are looking around, hoping someone more qualified, more confident, or more willing will take charge. But your brain processes the situation differently. You see the vacuum of leadership and feel a moral obligation to fill it, even when every instinct tells you to let someone else handle it. It's not confidence that drives you forward, it's conscience. When you see a problem that needs solving, an injustice that needs addressing, or a crisis that needs managing, you can't ignore it just because taking action would be difficult, dangerous, or uncomfortable. Your sense of responsibility overrides your personal comfort zone. And here's something that happens to reluctant leaders that others don't understand. You experience genuine anxiety and reluctance about stepping forward. You don't want the responsibility, the risk, or the potential consequences, but you want to live with the results of inaction even less. You choose the harder path because the easier path feels morally impossible. Think about the moments in your life when you've stepped forward reluctantly. Maybe you reported workplace harassment when others stayed silent. Maybe you organized help for a neighbor in crisis when everyone else just talked about how sad the situation was. Maybe you stood up to a bully when everyone else looked away. These weren't moments of ambition, they were moments of moral necessity. The psychology of reluctant leadership often comes from what researchers call moral courage, the ability to act on ethical principles even when doing so is costly, difficult, or dangerous. Unlike physical courage, which responds to immediate threats, moral courage responds to situations where someone should act, but no one wants to bear the consequences of acting. You probably have a highly developed sense of personal responsibility and struggle with what psychologists call bystander effect immunity. While others can convince themselves that someone else will handle problems, your brain won't accept that logic. You feel accountable for outcomes in ways that allow others to remain passive observers. Research from Dr. Rushworth Kidder shows that people who demonstrate moral leadership in crisis situations often share certain characteristics. They have strong ethical foundations, high empathy for others' suffering, and low tolerance for injustice or inaction when action is needed. But most importantly, they can't live with themselves if they don't act according to their principles. But here's what makes reluctant leadership psychologically complex. You're simultaneously motivated by moral obligation and paralyzed by the personal cost of leadership. You know that stepping forward might bring criticism, conflict, danger, or responsibility you don't want. But not stepping forward feels like betraying your own values and potentially allowing harm that you could prevent. This internal conflict creates what researchers call moral stress, the psychological tension between personal safety and ethical responsibility. You're not choosing between good and bad options. You're choosing between self-protection and moral action, both of which have legitimate psychological importance. You know that feeling when everyone in a room knows something should be done, but everyone is hoping someone else will do it? You're the person whose conscience won't let you participate in that collective avoidance. You become the leader not because you're naturally dominant, but because you're morally uncomfortable with leaderless situations where people might suffer. Here's something fascinating about reluctant leaders. You often have more credibility and moral authority than people who seek leadership positions. When someone steps forward despite obvious reluctance and personal cost, others recognize the authenticity of their motivation. You're not leading for personal gain, which makes your leadership more trustworthy and compelling. Throughout history, the most transformative leaders have been reluctant ones. Rosa Parks didn't want to become the face of civil rights. She was tired after work and just wanted to sit down. The firefighters who ran into burning buildings on September 11th weren't seeking heroism. They were doing their jobs despite extraordinary danger. Healthcare workers during pandemics don't volunteer for glory. They show up because patients need care, and someone has to provide it. Studies reveal that reluctant leaders often emerge in crisis situations because they possess a combination of competence and conscience that others recognize even when they don't recognize it in themselves. People turn to you not because you want to lead, but because you demonstrate the moral clarity and practical ability needed in difficult moments. Think about how exhausting this pattern can be. You're constantly being pushed into leadership roles you didn't seek, taking responsibility for situations you didn't create, and bearing the stress of making decisions that affect others' well-being. Leadership becomes a burden rather than a privilege, service rather than power. The reluctant leader psychology often develops from childhood experiences, where you learn that if you don't act, no one else will. Maybe you grew up in chaotic circumstances where someone had to be responsible, or you witnessed situations where adult inaction caused preventable harm. Your brain learned that moral action sometimes requires personal sacrifice. And here's something that makes reluctant leadership even more psychologically demanding. You don't get the satisfaction that power-seeking leaders derive from being in charge. You lead out of duty, not desire, which means you experience the stress and responsibility of leadership without the psychological rewards that motivate others to seek leadership positions. Most reluctant leaders also experience what psychologists call imposter syndrome around their leadership abilities. You don't feel qualified to be making important decisions or taking charge of situations, but you do it anyway because you recognize that qualifications matter less than willingness when no one else is stepping forward. But there's something beautiful about people who lead when no one else will. You represent the best of human moral development, the ability to act on principle despite personal cost, to take responsibility without seeking credit, and to serve others' needs, even when it's difficult or dangerous. This is leadership in its purest form. Research shows that societies with more reluctant leaders, people who step forward in crisis situations despite personal reluctance, have better outcomes in emergencies, higher levels of social trust, and more effective responses to collective challenges. Your willingness to lead when necessary creates safer, more ethical communities. The goal isn't to become someone who seeks leadership or to stop feeling reluctant about taking charge. Your reluctance is actually part of what makes your leadership valuable. It ensures that you lead for the right reasons, rather than for personal gain or ego satisfaction. You might find it helpful to recognize that your pattern of reluctant leadership serves a crucial social function. You're the person who ensures that important things get done, even when they're difficult, that moral standards are maintained, even when they're inconvenient, and that someone takes responsibility, even in situations where leadership is costly. And honestly, there's something profoundly meaningful about people whose sense of duty overrides their personal comfort. You're living according to principles that prioritize collective well-being over individual convenience, moral action over personal safety, and service over self-interest. The world needs reluctant leaders more than it needs ambitious ones. Ambitious leaders can be corrupted by power, motivated by ego, or distracted by personal gain. But reluctant leaders lead purely because leadership is necessary, which makes them more trustworthy, more authentic, and more effective at creating positive change. So the next time you find yourself stepping forward when no one else will, remember that you're participating in the highest form of human leadership. You're not leading because you want to. You're leading because someone must, and you're the one with the moral courage to bear that responsibility. Your reluctance doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. Your sense of duty doesn't make you a victim, it makes you a hero. Your willingness to lead when necessary, despite personal cost, represents the best of what humans can be when they choose principle over comfort. This is the leadership that built civilizations, ended injustices, saved lives, and created progress. Not the leadership of ambition, but the leadership of necessity. Not the leadership of ego, but the leadership of conscience. You are part of a tradition that includes every ordinary person who ever did something extraordinary simply because it needed to be done. Are you someone who steps forward when no one else will? Or do you wait for others to take charge? What do you think creates the moral courage needed to lead reluctantly in difficult situations? Let me know, because humanity depends on people who will lead when leadership is necessary, not just when it's desired. To get more psychology content like this in your feed, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share your experiences with us. You'll be supporting our efforts too. Thanks for watching.